When I saw my husband pick up the t-shirt from the back seat of my car, my heart skipped a beat, but not out of fear of some random confrontation. No, it was the fear of that realization. The shirt wasn't his. And it wasn't supposed to be there. He held it up between two fingers, inspecting it like it carried some invisible message, and I felt the blood drain from my face. I could tell the exact moment his mind began turning, linking fragments, searching for explanations I hadn't prepared. "Whose is this?" he asked, his voice too calm, too even, the kind of calm that makes your skin crawl. My throat closed. Words wouldn't come. I watched his expression shift from confusion to something darker, as if he'd stumbled on a crack in the wall he hadn't noticed before. My fingers twitched by my side. I had the impulse to snatch the shirt from him, throw it away, erase it from existence. But it was too late. It existed. He held it. And now he would wonder. That t-shirt, so harmless, so ordinary, was going to destroy the illusion I'd built for months. Or maybe, I thought, just maybe, it would only half destroy it. Maybe it would muddy the water instead of clearing it. My chest tightened as I realized I couldn't control what came next. His eyes narrowed slightly, the fabric still dangling from his hand like an accusation, and I knew, this was the moment everything would unravel. But before I tell you what happened next, and how a single choice months ago led us here, let me take you back to where it began. Because this isn't the kind of story you can explain in one breath. This is the kind of story you need to live through to understand. I used to think I was good at living inside routines. The quiet mornings, the same kitchen counter, the same coffee cup. There's a strange comfort in repetition. You know what's coming next, you can almost live on autopilot. But comfort can turn into numbness, and numbness has a way of creeping up on you without asking permission. My marriage wasn't bad. That's what made it so complicated to even admit what I was feeling. There were no screaming fights, no betrayals, at least not then, no dramatic cracks in the walls. My husband was stable, reliable, the kind of man who kept the house standing and the bills paid. But somewhere along the way, the warmth between us had cooled into something functional, like an old radiator that only hums because it's supposed to, not because it's burning. I'd noticed it in the little things first. He stopped brushing my shoulder in passing, stopped looking up from his laptop when I walked into the room. He still asked me how my day was, but his eyes were already elsewhere before I could answer. And I stopped expecting anything different. It's frightening how quickly you can get used to being unseen. Then, one rainy Tuesday, he came by. Not my husband, him, the man who would change everything. At that time, he was just the one who always seemed to know when we needed help. He'd show up with a toolbox, fix the loose door hinge, unclog the drain. He didn't belong to my daily world in the same way my husband did. Maybe that's what made his presence feel so sharp, so intrusive. He asked about the faucet first, but when I turned to answer, he wasn't looking at the faucet. He was looking at me. Not in a way that was inappropriate or obvious, more like he noticed something no one else had. "You seem tired," he said quietly. The words shouldn't have meant much. People ask that all the time. But the way he said it, the way he waited for my answer, made me feel like he genuinely wanted to hear it. I shrugged, brushing it off, but inside, I felt a flicker of something I couldn't name. That day, the rain didn't stop, and neither did the conversation. He stayed longer than he needed to, and I let him. He told me a story about his father teaching him how to mend a roof, and I found myself laughing, genuinely laughing, for the first time in what felt like months. Later, after he left, I caught myself lingering in the kitchen, looking at the spot where he'd stood, where his voice had filled the space. And for a brief, foolish moment, I imagined what it would feel like if someone looked at me that way every day. That evening, my husband came home late, shoulders heavy from work. He placed his keys on the counter, muttered something about a meeting that ran over, and kissed my cheek absently. I wanted to tell him about the rain, about the conversation, about how strange it felt to laugh like that again. But when I opened my mouth, he was already halfway to the bedroom, already gone in his head. The silence after the door closed felt different. He didn't do anything wrong. He was just tired. That's all. But I sat there at the table long after the dishes were done, staring at nothing, realizing that tiredness had become the only language we spoke. And maybe, just maybe, I didn't want to speak it anymore. The next morning felt like any other, but there was a subtle shift in the air that I couldn't quite name. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets slick and darkly shining, and the smell of wet earth drifted through the open window as I made coffee. I tried to tell myself that yesterday had been nothing, just a rainy afternoon, just a conversation. But the memory of that conversation clung to me like damp clothes. He came again, of course. He said it was to check the faucet one more time, but there was no urgency in his tone, no real need. It was an excuse, and I think we both knew it, though neither of us said it aloud. He knocked lightly on the door, as if testing the air, and when I opened it, there was that small, almost shy smile of his, the one that seemed to warm up an entire room. I noticed little things I shouldn't have, the way his jacket was damp from the mist outside, the faint smell of soap and wood that clung to him. I shouldn't have noticed, but I did. When he walked into the kitchen, the space suddenly felt different, as if every corner had woken up. We stood near the counter, close enough that I could feel the warmth from where he stood. It wasn't intentional closeness, not at first. It was the kind born of small kitchens and narrow spaces. But there was something about it that made my pulse quicken just a little. He asked how my evening had been, and I found myself telling him about nothing in particular, the leftovers I reheated, the email from my sister, the way the rain had kept me awake. He listened, really listened, the way people rarely do. Every time my words faltered, his eyes stayed steady on me, patient, like he had all the time in the world. And then there was a silence. Not the kind that makes you uncomfortable, but the kind that feels heavy, almost deliberate. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of a car passing outside, but in that moment, those sounds felt like background to something larger happening between us. I reached for a mug just as he did, our hands brushing. It was such a small thing, a fraction of a second, but it was enough to send a strange jolt through me, the kind of awareness you can't unfeel. I pulled my hand back too quickly, muttered something about needing to dry the dishes. He said nothing, but I felt his eyes on me as I turned away. Then it happened, that moment that couldn't be undone. We were standing by the counter, facing each other, the room quiet except for the rain still dripping from the gutters outside. There was no build-up, no dramatic pause, just a shared, silent understanding that hung between us like an invisible thread pulled too tight. We kissed. It was brief, almost accidental, but it carried a weight that stopped time for an instant. When it ended, we both stepped back, as if waking from a dream we hadn't meant to have. Neither of us spoke. He picked up the wrench he'd brought, fiddled with it like it suddenly required his full attention. I wiped my hands on a towel I didn't need to use. The air between us felt electric, fragile, as if one wrong word would shatter it. When he left, I watched him walk down the path, the mist settling on his shoulders. My hand went to my lips before I could stop it. It wasn't what I'd planned. It wasn't even what I thought I wanted. But it had happened. That evening, my husband came home at his usual time. He hung his coat on the same hook, left his shoes by the same mat, and kissed my cheek like always. I made dinner, we sat across from each other, and we spoke about bills and weather and the news. All the usual things. But as he talked, I felt that same jolt again, echoing in my memory, and for the first time, I wondered if I could keep this quiet, and for how long. The day after the kiss, the world felt too loud. The sound of the kettle boiling seemed sharper, the ticking of the kitchen clock too insistent. I tried to tell myself that nothing had changed, that I could box that moment up, seal it, and shove it into some corner of my mind where it couldn't touch my life. But pretending nothing happened doesn't make it true. I woke up before my husband, the light barely creeping through the blinds. I moved quietly, almost guiltily, though there was nothing visible to feel guilty for, nothing he could point to. He stirred once, muttered something in his sleep, then rolled over. I stared at the curve of his back, the same back I had seen for years, and wondered why it suddenly felt like a barrier between us. All morning I thought about what had happened, and about him, not my husband, but the one who kissed me. The one I kissed back. I replayed it in fragments, the way his hand had lingered for a fraction too long on the counter, the silent breath before it happened, the stillness after. It should have felt like a mistake, sharp and clear, but instead it felt like fog. A mistake, yes, but one that blurred lines instead of drawing them. He didn't come by that morning, or even that afternoon, and that should have been a relief. It wasn't. I found myself glancing toward the window, checking my phone, listening for footsteps outside that never came. I caught myself almost hoping the faucet would break again, just so he would have to fix it. By evening, I was restless. I made dinner the way I always did, set the table the way I always did, and when my husband walked through the door, I smiled like I always did. Routine is good at hiding things, until it isn't. He sat down, his tie already loosened, and told me about some numbers that didn't add up at work, about a colleague who had been late again. I nodded at the right places, murmured replies, but my thoughts kept slipping. When I put the plate in front of him, he looked up at me and frowned slightly, not at the food, but at me, as though something about me seemed off. "Are you okay?" he asked. I told him I was fine. Because what else was there to say? Later, when he fell asleep on the couch, I sat beside him and stared at the muted television. The images flickered across his face, and I wondered if he'd notice, if he'd sense it, if he'd ask the kind of questions I wasn't ready to answer. But he didn't stir. The next day, he came. Not my husband, him. I had been pretending to clean the already clean counter when I heard the knock, and my chest tightened. I told myself I could send him away, tell him now wasn't a good time. But I didn't. I opened the door. He stood there holding a small bag, a tool inside clinking faintly. "I thought I'd bring by a new washer for the faucet," he said, but neither of us really believed that was the reason. This time, there was no rain. The sky was pale, the air sharp. He stepped inside, and I felt that same shift in the room, the one that made every movement suddenly feel too deliberate. We didn't talk about the kiss. Not directly. But everything in how we moved around each other said we hadn't forgotten. When I handed him a towel, our fingers brushed again, and neither of us pulled back right away. He talked about the weather, about some errand he had to run later, but the words were placeholders. What mattered was the quiet in between, the glances that stayed a second too long, the way we stood too close in the small kitchen. When he finally left, I leaned against the door after it closed, pressing my palms against the wood as if I could steady myself that way. My breathing felt uneven, like I'd been holding something in for too long. That evening, my husband noticed something. Maybe it was my silence, maybe it was the way I avoided his eyes just a little too much. He didn't say anything directly, just glanced at me with a look I couldn't quite read. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I could still step back. But deep down, I knew I wouldn't. Not really. The days that followed felt like a balancing act on a wire I hadn't agreed to walk. Everything seemed normal on the surface, coffee brewed in the mornings, dishes stacked in the sink, the familiar hum of the refrigerator, but beneath that surface was a steady hum of tension I couldn't silence. I told myself I would slow things down, step back before the ground under me gave way. But stepping back is harder than it sounds when you've already taken those first, irreversible steps forward. My husband's routine didn't change, and that almost made things worse. He went to work at the same time, came home tired in the evenings, dropped his keys into the same bowl by the door. He didn't see anything unusual, at least not at first. That blind trust, the one I used to find comforting, now felt like something sharp lodged under my skin. He came again. I had started to expect it, almost against my will. That soft knock on the door didn't make me jump anymore, it made my breath catch in a different way. This time, he brought another excuse, something about checking a pipe in the bathroom. I knew it didn't need checking, but I let him in anyway. The moment he stepped inside, the room changed. It was the same kitchen, the same hallway, but somehow smaller, more crowded with the things we weren't saying. We avoided the subject of the kiss, but it lived in every glance, in the way we stood near each other without quite touching. He asked how I'd been, his tone casual but his eyes searching. I told him I'd been fine, and the word felt hollow even as I said it. He nodded like he believed me, though I think we both knew better. I could feel the weight of my husband even when he wasn't there. It wasn't guilt in the dramatic sense, it was quieter, heavier. Every time my husband called to say he'd be late, every time I saw his jacket hanging in the hall, there was a flicker of unease in my chest. Later that evening, my husband asked a question that made me pause. He picked up a receipt from the counter, one I'd carelessly left there, from a hardware store miles away. "What's this for?" he asked, his tone light but his eyes focused. I said something about needing new sponges, about forgetting to throw the slip away. He nodded slowly, set it down, and didn't press further. But there was a moment, a tiny shift, where I could see him filing the detail away, the way you do when something doesn't quite add up. That night, I lay awake next to him, the ceiling dark above us. He slept on his side, breathing steady, and I watched the faint rise and fall of his shoulders. My mind wouldn't stop racing. I thought about the kiss, about the way my guest's eyes lingered when he looked at me, about the conversations that felt like more than they should. I also thought about my husband, the man I'd built a life with, the one who trusted me without question. That trust felt like a weight and a shield all at once. The next day, when the knock came again, I almost didn't answer. Almost. But I did. He didn't bring tools this time. He brought coffee. 2 cups, still warm, the lids damp from steam. He handed me one and smiled in that small, easy way that unsettled me more than any bold gesture would have. We stood in the kitchen, holding our cups, sipping slowly. There was conversation, about errands, about a show he'd been watching, but underneath, there was the constant awareness of what had already happened and what might happen next. When he left, the air in the house felt thinner, like he'd taken something with him. That evening, my husband came home earlier than usual. He set his briefcase down and studied me for a moment, his brow slightly furrowed. "Did you have a good day?" he asked, his voice even. I nodded. Smiled. Said yes. And for a fleeting second, I wondered how long I could keep answering that way before he realized the truth. The next few days blurred together in a way that made it hard to separate one from the other. I went through the motions of my routine, laundry, dishes, answering emails, but each task felt like it belonged to a different version of me, someone who wasn't carrying the weight of a secret. I kept thinking about him. Not just about the kiss, though that thought was never far from me, but about the way he looked at me, like he saw pieces I didn't even show myself anymore. By now, his visits no longer surprised me. They had become something I expected, even if I never admitted that expectation to anyone, not even to myself. Each time he knocked, I felt that familiar rush of conflicting feelings, relief, excitement, guilt, a whisper of fear. That morning was different. He didn't bring tools, or coffee, or excuses. He simply appeared, holding a small bag of groceries, as if that made it casual, normal. "Thought you might need these," he said when I opened the door. It was a flimsy explanation, and we both knew it. But I let him in. I always did. We ended up in the kitchen, as we always seemed to. The counter between us was scattered with bags, bread, eggs, a jar of honey. Ordinary things, but the air around them was heavy with everything unspoken. He stood closer than usual, or maybe I just noticed the closeness more this time. We talked about nothing and about everything. He mentioned a place he'd been meaning to visit, a trail outside the city, quiet and tucked away. I told him about the call I'd had with my sister, how she'd asked if we might come see her sometime. The words were normal, but the tone underneath wasn't. At one point, I reached across the counter to move a bag, and his hand brushed mine. Not an accident. Not this time. I didn't pull back right away. Neither did he. The silence after that touch wasn't awkward. It was charged. Like the whole room was holding its breath, waiting. I don't know who moved first. Maybe it doesn't matter. We kissed. It was slower this time, deliberate in a way the first one hadn't been. And though it lasted only a moment, it left the kitchen feeling like it had shifted somehow, like the walls themselves had heard and would remember. When we broke apart, there was a pause, one of those pauses where everything feels suspended. He looked at me, and I looked back, and for a heartbeat, it felt like the world outside that room didn't exist. Then the spell broke. He stepped back, cleared his throat, said something about the groceries, though the words barely registered. I busied myself putting things away, my hands trembling slightly even as I tried to steady them. When he left, the house felt too quiet, almost hollow. I leaned against the counter, my palms pressed to the cool surface, and tried to make sense of what I'd just let happen. Again. That evening, my husband came home at the usual time. He was tired, he's always tired these days, and he dropped his bag by the door before loosening his collar. He kissed my cheek the way he always does, and asked about my day. I answered. I said the words he expected. But I couldn't stop thinking about the kiss, about the way it lingered like an echo I couldn't silence. Later, after he'd gone to bed, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the jar of honey left on the counter. It was such an ordinary thing. But even that felt like a reminder, a small, golden witness to the choice I'd made. And the choice I would keep making. After the second kiss, the days didn't feel like they blurred together anymore, they felt like they stacked, each one heavier than the last, a quiet pressure I couldn't quite release. There was a shift now, subtle but undeniable, in how I moved through my days, how I thought, how I noticed the spaces around me. Everything felt sharper, yet somehow more fragile at the same time. I woke up early that morning, before the sun had fully lifted over the rooftops, the room painted in that pale gray light that makes everything look softer than it really is. My husband was still asleep, turned slightly away from me, his breathing deep and even. I watched him for a moment, an ache in my chest I couldn't name pressing down, then quietly slipped out of bed. The kitchen was cool, the tile cold under my feet. I busied myself with the small rituals, boiling water, slicing bread, anything that might tether me to normalcy. But even as I worked, my mind wasn't quiet. I thought about what I'd done, about what I kept letting happen, and the thought didn't come with a single clear emotion. It was a blend, guilt, longing, fear, a strange comfort I didn't want to examine too closely. The knock came later that morning, and though part of me had expected it, my heart still jumped when I heard it. The sound felt louder than usual, echoing through the hallway like a reminder. When I opened the door, he was there, standing with the same ease as always, but there was something different in the way he held himself. He didn't bring groceries this time, or tools. He just came. He stepped inside, and I could almost feel the shift in the air, like someone had opened a window I didn't know was there. We didn't talk about the kiss, just like we hadn't talked about the first one. But the silence between us wasn't empty. We stayed in the kitchen for a while, the same place where everything always seemed to happen. The morning light made the countertops glow, the dust in the air visible like tiny drifting signals. He leaned against the counter, casual, but I could feel his eyes on me in a way that wasn't casual at all. He asked how my evening had been, his voice easy, and I told him it was fine. I told him about dinner, about a phone call, about the laundry I'd folded. I didn't tell him about how I'd lain awake, staring at the ceiling, thinking about his hand brushing mine, his mouth on mine, about how my thoughts refused to settle even as the night dragged on. He nodded, like he understood the things I didn't say. The rest of the day was full of small details, but each one carried too much meaning. When our arms brushed as we both reached for a dish, when his voice dropped slightly as he asked a question that didn't need asking, those things stuck, even after he left. Later, my husband came home earlier than expected. He wasn't upset, just tired, the way he always seemed to be these days. He dropped his bag by the door and lingered in the kitchen for a moment longer than usual, his eyes scanning the space like he was trying to notice something, though he didn't ask. That evening, as he told me about his day, about traffic, about a meeting that ran long, I found myself listening but also not listening. The words reached me, but they didn't land. My mind wandered elsewhere, to places I shouldn't have let it go. The following day, he, the one I couldn't stop thinking about, came again. This time he didn't need an excuse, and he didn't offer one. He just arrived, as if his presence itself had become reason enough. I should have stopped it. I should have said no, told him to turn around, told him to stay away. But I didn't. Instead, I found myself standing closer than I meant to, speaking softer than I needed to, watching his face when he talked about the smallest things, like the weather shifting or the road he'd taken to get here. Every choice I made felt both deliberate and unthinking at the same time. When he left, I stood in the doorway for a long moment, staring at the empty path, my hands wrapped around the doorframe like I could hold on to something steady that way. Inside, the house was quiet again. Too quiet. I sat down at the table, the weight of the silence pressing in on me, and I realized that this wasn't something I could simply undo. Not anymore. It had gone past that, quietly and steadily, without me even noticing until it was too late. The morning he sent the message, I read it 3 times before I let myself answer. There was nothing dramatic about the words, nothing that would raise an eyebrow if anyone else had seen them. Just a suggestion, a quiet invitation, *, I'll be at the old house this afternoon. It's empty. Maybe you could stop by. The old house. A place I hadn't thought about in years, though I knew exactly where it was. His family's property, long unused, sitting on the edge of a narrow road outside the city. I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button for what felt like forever. I told myself not to go. I told myself a dozen reasonable excuses, laundry, errands, the simple fact that I had no business being there. But even as I thought those things, I knew I would go. The drive out there felt longer than it probably was. The road narrowed, the houses thinned, and the city gave way to patches of field and trees. The air felt different, clearer somehow, and my hands gripped the wheel too tightly. When I pulled up, the house stood there, quiet and still, its windows clouded with dust and time. His car was already in the drive. He opened the door when I knocked, though the sound was barely necessary. The house was silent enough that any touch against the wood echoed. He stepped aside, and I walked in. The inside smelled faintly of old wood and emptiness. A single chair leaned against the wall, a window half open to the breeze. Everything about the place felt paused, waiting. We didn't talk much at first. There wasn't anything to say that hadn't already been said in other ways. He gestured toward the room, asked if I wanted something to drink, though there wasn't much to offer. I shook my head. The quiet pressed in, but it didn't feel suffocating. It felt inevitable. I don't remember who reached out first, who closed the space that had been holding us apart. I only remember that there was no hesitation left. The lines we had been tiptoeing along for weeks were already fading. We spent the night together. After, the house felt heavier, as though it now carried something it hadn't before. I sat on the edge of the chair, staring at the window, the moonlight barely cutting through the haze. My thoughts wouldn't settle, they never did anymore, but this time they felt tangled in a way that made my chest tight. He sat across from me for a while, neither of us speaking, and the silence said more than words could have. The drive home in the early morning was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums in your ears. The streets were mostly empty, the world not quite awake, and I felt the weight of what I'd done pressing in from all sides. When I walked into the house, the light was still dim. My husband was in the kitchen, already dressed for the day, his tie slightly askew as he sipped his coffee. He looked at me and smiled, just a small, ordinary smile, like nothing had changed. But everything had. The morning after the old house, everything felt heavier, like even the air in the kitchen had thickened. I stood by the sink, my hands under the cold tap, but I wasn't really washing anything. I was trying to steady myself, to make my breathing match the rhythm of the water, but nothing about me felt steady anymore. When I turned off the tap and looked up, he was there, my husband, standing in the doorway, his tie already knotted, a coffee cup in his hand. He looked at me with the same calm expression he always wore in the mornings, but there was a pause before he spoke, just a second too long. "You were out late," he said finally. The words weren't sharp, but they landed like a stone dropped into still water. I told him something about an errand that ran longer than I'd planned, about helping a friend, about losing track of time. I don't even know which version of the excuse made it past my lips. I only know that the lie tasted stale the moment I said it. He nodded, like he accepted it, but his eyes stayed on me a moment longer. That extra second felt like it stretched. When he left for work, the sound of the door closing seemed louder than usual. The day crawled. I moved through it like someone acting out a role, doing what I was supposed to do, laundry, emails, dinner prep. But none of it felt real. The memory of last night clung to me in flashes, the creak of the floorboards, the chill of the empty house, the way my own choices echoed louder than any sound. By the time he, the one I couldn't stop thinking about, sent a short message asking if I was all right, I didn't answer right away. I stared at the screen for a long time, my fingers hovering. Part of me wanted to write back instantly, to feel that jolt of connection. Another part of me wanted to throw the phone into the drawer and slam it shut. In the end, I replied simply, "I'm fine." But I wasn't. When my husband came home that evening, he noticed things. I could tell by the way his eyes moved, scanning the room, then my face, then the room again. He didn't ask questions, not directly, but there was a new sharpness in him, a new alertness I hadn't seen before. We ate dinner in near silence, the clinking of forks sounding too loud in the space between us. At one point, he glanced at my phone where it sat face down on the counter, and I saw his brow crease ever so slightly. That night, I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling while he breathed evenly next to me. Every sound, the tick of the clock, the rustle of the sheets, felt magnified. The next day was worse. I thought I'd been careful, thought I'd tidied every loose end, but I hadn't. It was a small thing, a sweater I didn't recognize, folded neatly on the back seat of my car. I saw it that morning when I opened the door, and my heart thudded once, too hard. I shoved it under a bag before I could think, but I knew the image of it was burned into my mind. When I got home, my husband was in the driveway. He had come back earlier than usual, and for a second, I froze, gripping the steering wheel too tightly. He didn't say anything about the sweater. He didn't even glance at the car. But I felt his eyes on me, felt him noticing things he hadn't before. That evening, the silence between us wasn't calm. It wasn't comfortable. It was the kind that hummed, tense and waiting. I kept thinking about what I'd done, not just the night at the old house, but every choice that had led there. Every yes when I could have said no, every door I had opened instead of closing. By the time I went to bed, the thought that looped in my head wasn't about what had already happened. It was about what would come next. Because I could feel it now, like the faint tremor before a storm, the sense that something was starting to unravel. It was a Thursday when the thread began to fray for real. The day started like any other, coffee, emails, the faint hum of the dishwasher, but there was an edge in the air, a quiet weight that followed me from room to room. I tried to move as if nothing had shifted, tried to play the part of the woman I had been before. But the truth was, that version of me didn't exist anymore. Too many choices, too many little steps in the wrong direction had erased her. The first sign came when my husband came home earlier than usual. He didn't call ahead. He didn't text. I just heard the crunch of tires in the driveway and looked up to see his car through the kitchen window. For a moment, my breath caught, as if I'd been caught doing something even though I was only stirring soup. He walked in carrying nothing but his keys, but there was something in his face, a kind of careful stillness, the kind that made my stomach knot. "Busy day?" he asked, his tone light, but I heard the quiet check in it. I nodded, offered some vague answer, but he wasn't really listening to the words. His eyes were moving, over the counters, over the dishes, over me. Like he was looking for something, even if he didn't know what. Later, when he went to the garage, I stepped outside to take a breath, and that's when I saw it. The sweater. The same sweater I'd hidden under a bag in the car days ago, now folded neatly in the corner of the back seat. My husband must have found it. He must have held it, maybe even wondered who it belonged to. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break my ribs. I told myself it could still be explained, it was just a sweater, after all. People leave things behind all the time. But deep down, I knew it wasn't the sweater itself that mattered. It was what it suggested. When I came back inside, he was standing by the counter, holding a glass of water. He didn't mention the sweater. He didn't mention anything at all. But his silence was louder than words. That evening, we sat down to dinner, and I could feel his eyes on me between bites. Not glaring, not accusing, just watching. Carefully. I forced myself to keep talking, about the weather, about a neighbor's dog, about anything that would fill the space. But my own words felt thin, brittle, like they might snap in half if he pressed on them. After dinner, he cleared the plates without asking. He almost never did that. The clink of dishes in the sink sounded sharp in the quiet kitchen. I went upstairs early, saying I was tired, though sleep was the last thing on my mind. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling my heart hammer as I listened to the muffled sounds of him moving around downstairs. The house felt different now. Every creak of the floor, every door closing softly, felt like a question being asked without words. I thought about calling him, the one I'd been seeing, but I didn't. My phone stayed on the nightstand, its screen dark, the silence stretching between us like a rope pulled too tight. For the first time, the thought that circled in my mind wasn't about what we'd done, or even about what we might do next. It was about what my husband knew. Or what he might know. Because I could see it now, in his quiet eyes, in the pause before he spoke, in the way he looked at me like I was something he couldn't quite read. He knew something. Or worse, he was starting to. The morning light was thin, barely pushing through the curtains when I woke, my heart already thudding too fast, as if it had never slowed through the night. I listened to the faint sounds of the house, the pipes settling, the distant drone of a neighbor's lawnmower, the soft shuffle of my husband moving in the kitchen below. I stayed in bed longer than usual, afraid that if I got up, the world would tip, and all the pieces I'd been balancing would finally scatter. When I did go downstairs, he was there, as always. He had made coffee, poured 2 cups, and left one at my usual seat. I tried to steady my hands as I sat, the mug warm but my fingers ice cold. For a long time, neither of us said anything. There was no accusation, no raised voice, only the kind of silence that settles like dust everywhere and in everything. He finally spoke, his voice soft but steady. "You seem far away lately." I stared at the mug. The answer was there if he wanted it, written in every avoidance, every late return, every unfinished conversation over the last few weeks. I tried to find the words that would make it all less messy, but there were none. Nothing could untangle what I had woven. "I know," I said. It was the only truth I could manage. He nodded, looking at me for a moment longer before letting his eyes drift away. There was something in his expression that made my stomach drop, not anger, not even hurt, but a kind of resignation, a quiet acceptance that whatever we had been, we weren't that anymore. We moved through the motions of the day. I washed the dishes, he fixed a cabinet hinge, we spoke about groceries and bills, each line of dialogue floating in that fragile space where routine is the only thing holding 2 people together. Yet beneath the surface, the tension hummed, not the heat of a fight, but the cool dread of what comes after. I caught him glancing at me when he thought I wouldn't notice. He was searching for answers, for some sign, but what he found must have only confirmed what he already feared. At one point, I found him in the driveway, hands on the roof of the car, staring down at the concrete like he could read the whole story there. That evening, after dinner, he spoke again. "Is there anything you want to tell me?" he asked, his voice so measured it barely trembled. I almost told him. I almost let every secret pour out right there, tired of the lies, tired of carrying the weight alone. My mouth opened, and for a second, the room held its breath. But then I shook my head. "No," I whispered, unable to look at him. He nodded, the smallest, saddest smile flickering on his lips. "Okay," he said. He didn't press. He didn't accuse. We cleaned the kitchen together in silence. He passed me plates, I dried them. Our hands brushed once, but neither of us reacted. Later, I lay awake in the dark, my husband's breathing steady beside me. I thought about every choice, every crossroads where I could have turned back and didn't. I thought about the man I had let into my life, about the moments that had led me here, and about the man beside me now, not just my husband, but the witness to my undoing. The house was silent, but my mind was not. I understood, finally, that the hardest thing about secrets isn't keeping them. It's living with what they do to you, and to the people who trust you most. I didn't know what would happen next. Maybe tomorrow, he would ask again. Maybe I would finally answer. Maybe we would find a way forward, or maybe we would drift even further apart. But tonight, all I had was the hush between us and the weight of everything that had gone unsaid. And that was how it ended, not with a revelation, not with a storm, but with the quiet realization that some things, once broken, can never return to what they were.